Hi, and welcome to Dutch the Podcast. I'm Mike, and right there, inside of his house, is Tom Byfoot. He is the publisher of everything to do Dutch in Canada, across America, and even in the Netherlands, Dutch the Media. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Mike. Hey, you're sitting outside on the deck. Looks lovely.
Well, it beats the doghouse, which is usually where you'll find me. Anyway, having said that, it is a beautiful spring evening here in Ontario, and we're reaching across the country to Vancouver, well, just outside of Vancouver to BC, and where you are. And then we're going to come back with our story later on to Ontario, to London, Ontario. Before we do that, I'm going to remind you to subscribe to the podcast, let a friend know about it, and follow everything to do Dutch at dutchthemedia.com.
We're talking to Brad and Els Seltzer. Brad and Els, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Tom.
Yes.
So before we start about the actual topic of this episode, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself. So who are Brad and Elisabeth Seltzer?
Okay.
Go ahead, Els.
My name's Elisabeth. I was born in the Netherlands, in Mokeham, 5 years after the war. So that was a long time ago. When I was about 2, my parents immigrated to Canada. We lived in Saskatchewan for about 5 years. The weather was too difficult for my mother, so we moved to Ontario. And that's where I grew up, in Essex County area. I met the love of my life in high school. And I went on to become a teacher. I taught primary school. And then, while Brad and I got married, we had 3 children. I was a stay-at-home mom during that time. And after the children were grown a bit, I did go back to work. I went to retail. I was out of teaching for too long for me, so I did that. But Brad and I have been married for 52 years, and I think in that time we got to know each other well enough and figure each other out that we could work together to write a book, and that's what we did.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so Brad, maybe briefly about your background as well. You're not Dutch, but we'll get to the Dutch part of the story soon enough.
I was born in Stratford, where we now live, but I left town with my parents and my siblings in 1965. And that took me down into Essex County, where Elsie lived, and she and I met in high school, really. After high school, I went to college in Windsor, and graduated with a technology diploma there that allowed me to be an architectural draftsman. So I spent a better part of 3 years as an architectural draftsman. I left that field, and I got into policing. So I was involved in policing for 30 years. And we moved around to several places in southwestern Ontario, wherever my role took me.
So you were in the OPP, in the Ontario Provincial Police?
Yeah, I was in OPP for 30 years. And
so, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, when my policing career finished, while I was in policing, I worked part-time at a university degree. So when I left policing with a university degree as well, I was able to get into Conestoga College in Kitchener in faculty, and I taught at that college for 9 years before I retired. And now
what did you teach, right?
I taught policing procedures and ethics in policing. There was about 250 students a year, so it was a 2-year program. Even actually, it's a 3-year program. So I would say there's at any given time there was over 300 students that were involved in the classes that I was involved in.
Okay. So neither of you have a background in journalism or writing or anything like that. But nevertheless, you wrote a 300-plus page book, a book that was published very recently, and you wrote it together. And I was just wondering, maybe you can give us a very high-level outline of what the book's about. You mentioned the war, Elisabeth, at the start. You were born a few years after the war, which means that your parents, as young adults, lived through the war. What's the book about?
Well, the book is about my father, Peter, and his experiences in the war. The Germans had come up with a program that, well, they needed slaves, they needed workers in their country to keep the economy going, because most of the young men and women were involved in the military. So they started a program whereby young men, anywhere from, say, 19 to 40, got a letter saying they had to report to work there. Some of them were in factories, some of them were in farms. Dad was a mechanic and a truck driver, which was, to be able to drive a truck in those days was not as common as it is now. So that was quite a coup for him to be able to do that. So with those abilities, he was sent to a compound in Germany, and he had to live with the soldiers and other men like him doing that job. He repaired vehicles that were shot up or, you know, damaged in the war. And another job for him was to make deliveries. And those deliveries were to other compounds with soldiers or to camps that were held political prisoners. And the story begins when he boards the train and he's headed for Germany, and he tells us all of the things that he saw and the things that happened to him in that 2.5 years that he was gone. It was a tough go.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention for our listeners, Elisabeth, the background. So he was sent to Germany, but more than 500,000 young Dutch men were sent to Germany as forced labor. So he was a forced laborer, and it was not by choice that he went. No, if he had not gone, he would have been liable to be sent to a concentration camp or to be shot. And he worked under very dangerous circumstances. I don't want to get too much ahead of the story, but I just want to clarify that this is not an uncommon. No, 500,000
job opportunity, so to speak.
Yeah.
No, he was forced. He was really a slave. But there were young men from all the occupied countries. You know.
Yeah, I read up on it, about 10 million, I believe.
Yeah, from all over Europe. And they were all oppressed, and I mean, they weren't fed well. He saw so many things that a 19, 20-year-old should never have to be part of. And that caused him a lot of trauma over the years. And that's the story that we wanted to tell.
Yeah, and I read the book, and I actually gave it to my son, who is 18 years old. So exactly the age your dad was, very close to the age your dad was when he was sent to Germany. And I just couldn't imagine my son at his age doing that. He was fascinated by the book, and of course he could really identify very much with your father's story. So the story follows him during those. How many years was he in Germany, did you say?
2.5.
2.5. And one of the fascinating parts for me, but we'll maybe get to that in a bit, is the chaos in Germany at the end of the war that he lives through, and the atrocities he witnesses. But let's go back to the beginning. How did you come up with the idea to write a book? I mean, I said you're not authors. this is your dad's story, Elisabeth, your father-in-law, Brad. What happened? Why did you start writing the book, and how long did it take?
Oh, okay. Well, when I was younger, Dad never talked about it. If you ask questions, he refused to talk about it at all. But later, I was married. I had kids already. I was always curious, but again, he wouldn't talk about it. And I was visiting him one day, and he was cleaning the garage. He was up on top of a ladder, and he was moving things around up there and, busying himself. And I was watching him, and I saw this big brown box with a door handle on it, and tied with a piece of binder twine, and I had never seen it before. And I said to him, well, what's the big box? He said, it's not a box, it's a suitcase. And I said, a suitcase? And he said, yeah, this is the suitcase that I carried with me all through Germany. And I didn't know really much about that time at all. And I said, you were in Germany in the war? And he said, yeah. Were you a soldier? No, I was on forced labor. And so I said, well, open it up. Let's see what's inside. Well, I said, it's empty. There's nothing in here. It's just stinky and old. And he said, it's full of memories. There's nothing else here but memories. He said, I keep the suitcase to remind me of what I went through. He said, when I came home from Germany, people didn't believe what I told them. My experiences, they didn't believe it. So I stopped talking about it. But he said, I know it happened. I know it's all true. And he said, the suitcase keeps the memories for me. And that's why I have it. And then he very, almost reverently, I guess, closed it up, and that was that. And I said to him, you had that suitcase when you were 20 years old. You took it all through the war. You had it in Holland. You brought it across the ocean. You had it in Saskatchewan, and you've had it here for 20 years. This is the first time I've ever seen it. And he said, no. It holds my memories. It's hard to talk about, and I just don't. I said, but you should. I want to know. And he said, well, I can't. When I try, I suggested to him that he try to write it down. Maybe that would be easier than talking about it.
What was he at this time, approximately, Elisabeth?
It would have been 30 years ago, probably, at least, yeah.
And he's no longer with us, right?
No, he's not. Okay. So anyway, I suggested maybe he could try to write it down. So he started to do that. He agreed. And a few months later, he came to my door one day and he said, I can't do this. When I try to write about it, I have to remember it exactly as it happened. And he said, I'm 19, I'm hungry, I'm scared. I can't do it. And I said, well, maybe it would help for us to talk about it then. And so that's how it started. We had tea, we talked about it, and slowly he started to open up. I think I had to earn his trust first, that I would show that I believed him, because that was the big thing. People didn't believe what he experienced. So over the next 25 years, I listened to stories. I wrote things down. He let me tape them. In the beginning, it was just kind of iffy. But once, like after my mother died, then he felt freer to talk. And you never knew when a story was going to come. We would be in a restaurant and he would just tell me something and I'm scribbling on a napkin, or, I had bits and pieces everywhere about his story. So finally, I thought I had enough information, and I put it together in my way and was going to present it to my kids. You should know about your grandpa and that kind of thing. So I thought, well, maybe I should show it to Dad first, just to make sure everything's okay. So I presented him with this story, and he listened and he read and he thought about it for a bit. And then I said, well, what do you think? He said, well, honey, it's like this. You got all the details right. This is what happened to me. That's right. But he said, I don't feel the pain, the hunger, the horror. I don't smell it. I don't see the bombs. I don't feel the heat from the fires. And he said, there's a lot of stories about war, but they're so cleaned up. You could give it to your grandmother for her birthday. He said, that's not my story. If you can put, especially the fear, he said, if you can put that in there, then you've got yourself a story. That's my story. So I thought, wow,
that's quite the challenge at that point.
That's right. And I thought, I'm out of my depth. I can't do this. So I said, well, I'll do my best. The kids got that version of the story anyhow. But I talked to Brad. I mean, he's very articulate. He was a professor. He gets details. And more than anything, like he said, I know how men talk. I know how men think. And I had a very clean version of what happened. And I think, honestly, I was trying to protect my dad. I think
as a good daughter will do, right?
Yes. Sure. I didn't want him to hurt more by reading something really graphic, but that's not what he wanted. He said, you got to get the dirty parts in there. The horror, the war is grotesque, and your book isn't. And he was kind, but he thought, if you're going to do this, do it right. So that's when Brad and I talked, and Brad said, okay, let's give it a try. And so from then on, we had my version so that we got the details right. That was all okayed by Dad. And then we worked on the dirt and the other things, and tried to tell the story that he wanted told. And that took us then the pandemic happened, actually. So we had...
It was a daily routine.
Yeah, every day. Exactly. We would get up and say, okay, where's Peter going today? What's going to happen? And as long as I called him Peter, I didn't get too upset. I had to sort of switch gears.
It creates a bit of distance, right? It's not Dad, it's Peter, right? And it's Peter at the age of 20, and not your dad at whatever age he was at the time.
That's right. So then Brad took over, and we worked together, and that was quite a challenge for him too. He knew my dad well, and I know you loved my dad. You were very, very close. So when Brad wrote a bit about it, I could hear Dad saying it that way. I could hear Dad's, when he came up with a crazy idea, I thought, yeah, that would be my dad. He would look at it that way,
And reading the book, you get to know him very, very well. You've really captured his character. I mean, I've never met him. I don't know him, but from the pages, a person jumps out. It's not two-dimensional. It's very three-dimensional, clearly. But sorry, continue. So through the pandemic, you worked on it?
Yeah, every day. I mean, we were all isolated and, you know, we're both retired, of course. And so we did it every day. And then when we thought it was ready, well, in the meantime, Dad passed away. So he never got to read this version.
That's unfortunate. Did he see parts of it or none at all?
No, because when I showed him the first version, actually we were in Europe at the time, and I gave it to him to read because we had gone to Germany to learn more things and stuff, and that's when he read it, and he died about 3 years later. So
I never saw it.
Sad.
He never
Yeah.
saw it, but I think he was at peace to know that at least I got the right details.
Oh, that's great to know. Yeah. So you traveled to Germany with him as part of your fact finding. Just for our listeners, on the cover of the book, it says based on true events, which it becomes very clear where you got that. You spent 30 years collecting stories, but you also did research in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you found and what you saw?
Well, we visited family, and we learned stories about my mother, and we learned things about Dad. We also, okay, let me backtrack. Brad did some research about forced labor. And through that research, he discovered that there was a museum in Overloon in the southern part of Holland. And they had a large display about forced labor. And this was the first time that I think forced labor was really recognized. I guess they set this up in 1996 or something like that. But up until then, when you talk about forced labor, people don't even know what it is.
Yeah, but then just interject there. I read an article in a Dutch newspaper about a month ago about a book that was published in Dutch, also by a child of a forced laborer. One of the things that comes out of that, yeah, and I'm going to see if we can contact them. But out of the article, it became very apparent that for many years after the war, decades after the war, this was not spoken about. No, there was a lot of talk about the Holocaust. There was a lot of talk about the hunger winter that we maybe touch on a little bit as well. There was a lot of talk about the resistance, but this whole group of more than 500,000 men who were sent to Germany to work under often horrible circumstances was almost swept under the rug. People for some reason, didn't want to talk about it. The men didn't want to talk about it because they were traumatized, as you mentioned, and there were terrible memories, and they wanted to move on. But of course, that catches up with you later in life. But I just wanted to let our listeners know that this has been a subject that really has only been talked about seriously in the Netherlands over the last 10, 15 years. Sorry, back to Overloon.
Okay. Can I just interject a thought here? Dad experienced that people didn't believe him, but there was also a bit of a feeling that if you went to forced labor, then you were the coward. You took the easy way instead of staying and joining the resistance. There was a bit of that he experienced, like, oh yeah, you just went to Germany and worked in a factory. Well, no, it was pretty horrible what he experienced, what the factory workers experienced. Like, it was a horrible thing. But I think that there was an attitude, according to Dad.
No, and exactly that article I just mentioned, it raised exactly the same point.
Oh,
this guy had also basically not talked about it because he felt that people looked at it as the easy way out.
Yeah,
but let's not forget, in that case, more than 500,000 people would have taken the easy way out. There's no way that that's the case, and it's good that that's finally being discussed as well, even though it's very late for the men. You know, the few survivors that might still be alive, because otherwise they would all be, you know, they'd all be in the 90s or 100 years old. But there was that after the war. After the war, there was a very clear line that didn't acknowledge the fact that there was a large gray area. It wasn't either resistance or collaboration. Everyone had to survive. It was a very hard time to survive. So you did what you could. And everyone was traumatized in a way. So, yeah, sorry. But
okay.
This is an interesting discussion and an important discussion to have because it exonerates maybe a feeling that lived in the Netherlands soon after the war, but has subsided, fortunately.
Sure. Well, we went to this wonderful museum at Overloon on our trip, and it's just an amazing experience. I think it was validation for Dad. It was exciting. You know, finally, people believed that what happened in forced labor. Well, when you get there, the outside there is this
monument.
Beautiful monument. It's just amazing. It makes you get goosebumps. But there's, I think, maybe 5 figures of men. Some of them their mouths are open, they're crying. Others have their head down. They look angry, but they don't have arms, and they're wrapped in chains. And it is so moving that you think these people were really helpless. They had no way to fight any of the awful things that happened to them. So that really affected Dad. When he saw that, it was like, wow, they nailed it.
And you have a picture of that monument in the book, right?
Yes, I do. Yes.
The plate that goes with that monument, I thought it was quite emotional to read about it, because it is almost like an apology, because it speaks to the fact that it wasn't until 1996 that even the Dutch government recognized and spoke about the forced labor. So, as you say, it wasn't from the war forward. It wasn't talked about, and it was almost an apology whereby they said, "Now we realize it. This is what it's all about. Come on in, and we'll show you a lot more." Yeah.
And it's great that your dad, Elisabeth, got to witness that and see that. What's in the museum when you talk about the forced labor, the history?
I'll tell you what Dad showed us. Okay, when he went in, he just was wide-eyed, like a kid at Christmas almost. He was so excited. He just said, "Look at this. This is an example of a call-up letter that he would have received to be sent there." There was a book of timesheets like he would have filled out every day. There was propaganda posters that he recognized from Holland before he went, you know, saying, well, of course, the propaganda from the Germans saying, "Join the NSB, you know, join us, your life will be better." And then
the NSB was the collaborators party, political movement, like the Dutch Nazis, really.
Yes.
That's way to describe it. Yeah.
And there was also posters from the point of view of people against forced labor, saying, you know, if you can be a slave in Germany or dead in Holland. Like, what's worse? Like, it was just really, I didn't explain that very well, but really just all kinds of things about forced labor. The pictures, we didn't really explain this, but the letters that were sent out to tell men they had to go to Germany worked for only so long. it wasn't a fast enough way to get men to go. So the Germans started a new program that they called razzias. It was like a roundup. They would block off both ends of the street in Holland now. And I'm sure they did it in the other countries as well, but they would block off both ends of the street, the soldiers with their guns and trucks and everything, and they would just bang on doors, and people would open the door, and the soldiers would walk through, and if they saw someone of the right age and looked healthy that he should go to Germany, they took him. And they had these roundups without notice, and people were petrified.
There is God.
Yeah. And
that's something that happened a lot, and that people are still so traumatized by. One of the most famous ones was towards the end of the war in Rotterdam, the second largest city of the Netherlands, and they blocked off the entire city, and they marched off. I believe, I don't know the exact numbers, about 50,000 men in columns. They marched them through the country to Germany. And yeah, they did this all over the country, from small towns where they rounded up maybe 10, 15 men to large cities. Exactly. Thanks for mentioning that. That's a very integral part of the whole forced labor story.
Imagine how scary that would be.
What struck me was that the numbers, and the numbers were there because they weren't taking skilled men; they were taking men. If you were breathing and could work, you're gone.
Anyone within a certain age group, and I think they extended the age 18 through to first 40 and then 50 years of age, I believe.
And when they were there, they were expendable. They were poorly fed, poorly clothed, had to work in the elements, no clothing when they were in the cold. So as a result, if they died, so what? Get more. So
yeah, and there, it's hard to know exact numbers, but I did look it up, and it appears that about 10 to 15,000 Dutch men died in Germany as forced laborers. So we're not talking about the political prisoners or the Jews in the extermination camps. Just simply these people who went to Germany or were sent to Germany to work did not survive the war, and they were typically young men. So they wouldn't have died of natural causes.
No.
But they showed pictures of this, the roundups and everything. There was huge posters showing you exactly what it would be like. That's what they had in Overland too. It was just a wonderful exhibition, like really validating Dad, validating all forced laborers. It's an amazing thing to see. I think you can even see it online.
Oh yeah.
But
it's at Overloon in the Netherlands, right? And it's a permanent exhibition. It wasn't temporary. It's a permanent exhibit.
It's more than a building. I mean, it's a building in the grounds. They've got military equipment about the grounds, but in the building itself, like you spend a day easily.
So for all our listeners, because there's so many Dutch immigrants to Canada, and so many men were sent to Germany, that there's undoubtedly a good number of Canadian children and grandchildren of these forced laborers who may visit the Netherlands. So they should put Overloon on their itinerary if they get the chance. Right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You know, there was one interesting moment in our time in the museum. It just really struck me. There's an area in the museum that's it's just a small little area, but it's off. Well, how would you describe it? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you walk into a room, but you're on an elevated platform. It's like a stage, and you look down into the exhibit, and the exhibit is poorly, like lowly lit, and it's soft. There may have been soft music. I'm not sure, but
I think so.
It's a reverence that you feel as soon as you walk in there.
But in that exhibit, there's menorah, Star of David, the Jewish flag, like everything Jewish, and it's very artistic, aesthetic, very calm. It's really beautiful. And while we were nearby, 2 German soldiers came in. They were just young, and they were in fatigues. And I'm not sure what told me they were German, but I was sure they were German soldiers. And they hung back until people were out of the way, and then they went up and just stood, and very reverently they removed their hats, and they just stood and they just had a moment. And I thought, wow, it was just really
very touching.
Very touching.
Yeah.
You know, very respectful, and they were probably 20-ish. They were just young guys. So, you know, but it was quite a touching moment. It was something.
Yeah, that sounds very touching. Absolutely. So we talked about the dangers, and one of the things that I read the book, of course. I worked with you on it for a bit, but maybe we get to that. But we all know about the Allied bombings on Germany, and how cities like Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin were basically flattened with lots of casualties. We've got to remember that these forced laborers lived right between the German people as well. And your dad, Elisabeth in particular, lived through those bombings of Hamburg, right?
Oh, yeah. That was horrific. Well, Brad can probably describe it better than me. He wrote all about it, but I can't imagine. You know, the ground shakes, there's fire everywhere. Yeah. Maybe we should talk about that. Dad explained it, and Brad could really.
Well, in the area that he was in Fürstenmoor, and Fürstenmoor is it's part of Hamburg now, but back then it was an outskirt type town, and that's where the compound was that he was set up in. So the bombing wasn't necessarily intended for Fürstenmoor, but from high heights, the bombers didn't have that much ability to strike right down in Hamburg and not hit Fürstenmoor. So there was times when he had to run to a foxhole they had they all had to have a foxhole to get into when the bombing started, and the hours went by, and sitting there by yourself, and there's one time when he's thinking that, am I waiting to live or am I waiting to die? You know?
And again, you captured that very well in the book.
I think so. Dad would have liked that one.
Yeah,
I think so.
It
was very,
terrifying.
very
just terrifying.
Good. It's one of my favorites. Yeah.
But anyway, the book is 300 pages. I want people to read it. So we could spend hours talking about it, but they should read it. I did want to touch on one other aspect of the book, which I really appreciated. So Peter was dating a girl, or maybe he was engaged. I don't know. I don't remember exactly. And that girl became your mother later, Elisabeth. She stayed behind. That must also have been very tough. And let's remember, the final years of the war in the Netherlands were brutal for everyone. But you intersperse Peter's story with a number of chapters that follow Corey, right? Can you tell me why you chose to do that, and how you feel it makes the story even more whole, more complete?
Okay. Well, I think because there's a love story there. You know that when you're separated from the person that you love, you're thinking about them all the time. You worry about them. So Peter in Germany was constantly worried about Corey. Will she still be there? Will she be married? You know, like just anything. He was always worried about her. And Corey the same. Now, Corey...
Did they have contact? Could they
no.
write each other, or well, obviously not phone, but...
Early on, I think in the first 6 months, they were allowed to send letters. And Mom got one letter and sent one letter.
In 2.5 years.
To Peter. Okay. Mom and Dad had exchanged one letter. And then the Germans cut off any mail between the laborers and whatever. They couldn't communicate anymore. But Mom, if I can maybe give you a little history, she had a very difficult childhood. Very, very difficult. And when she met Peter, at last, she thought she was going to have a better life. And she loved him, and they were starting to make plans. But then the war happened. And once again, she's under all the restrictions, the controls, the difficulties of living in Holland at the time. So her story is, it's difficult too, all the things that happened to her. And because they're both my parents, I thought it was interesting to put both of them in the story. But also, as a reader, I like it when I know something that the hero of the story doesn't know. I think it makes it interesting, because when he worries about this, I think, oh yeah, I know that. It's okay. You know, that kind of thing. I like that. But also, I think Mom's story interjected like that was a buffer a bit, because sometimes the things that Dad had to go through were horrific. And I think it's hard for the reader even to just continue to be in this horrible place. So to talk about Dad primarily, and when it was really horrible, we stayed within the timeline of what was happening to Mom, but I learned stories of Mom's time in Holland through cousins and aunts and such, and we could put something about her. They weren't necessarily pleasant, but I think it kind of gave the reader a bit of a breather to say, okay, this is what's going on. And then we could pick up again with Peter and say, he survived it though, and this is what happened. I just thought it was a good mix,
Mm-hmm.
to put the two in there. And because she's a big part of his story and he's a big part of hers. So we did it all in the first person. She could tell her part. And I'm thinking to my children, to my grandchildren, but also to the reader as well. You're hearing it from her and you're hearing it from him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it was very powerful to have that switch between Germany and the Netherlands, where things were tough. We talked briefly hunger, winter. There was famine going on. There was people from the cities coming to the rural areas for food. We could do a whole separate podcast on that. So what I'd like to get to as we wrap up. The book is basically hot off the press, right? We've just, you haven't received the first shipment yet. It's on the way. But for our readers, you approached me about 1.5 years ago, I think, and were interested to see if Mokeham, my publishing company, would be interested in publishing it. And I read the manuscript and I immediately said, yes, we must publish this. And I really am grateful to you for reaching out to me, and I'm glad that we got it out. So the readers, the listeners should probably know that they can buy the book on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, on any sort of bookstore website, but they can also buy it on our own website at dutchthemedia.com. And I think you're going to try and do some events in the area where you live, maybe do some signings. We'll keep listeners apprised of that. But yeah, maybe some final words on the publication and getting the book between covers.
Well, we're thrilled that this was it was a dream come true for a long time, I think, and I think that we are pleased and proud to be able to have let Dad tell his story. That was very important to him. And I'm very proud that I married Brad and he knew how to do it. We could help each other. It's been a wonderful experience. And dealing with you, Tom, has just been a pleasure. You were so excited from the beginning, and that's just what we needed to keep on going. And
Wow.
I look forward to continuing in the future.
Thank you so much, and likewise, I really enjoyed working with you, and you were very meticulous. But the book it's a true story, 100% true story, but it's also an amazing read. It reads like a thriller. There are cliffhangers. There's the love story, as you mentioned, and it's not fiction. It's real. So, but it's a fantastic read. You know, thank you so much. I think we could talk for hours more, but I'm going to wrap it. It's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll let the listeners know a bit more details and show the cover maybe of the book in the next few minutes. But thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you,
Thank
Tom.
you, Tom, and thank you for the feedback that you've given us, because it tells us that we've achieved what we wanted to, and that is that, as Peter said, you didn't make it real enough. So I think we did, given the feedback that you've given us and others. So thanks very much for that.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so
once again, Tom, a fascinating story, and as tragic as it is, I mean, it plays out, as you pointed out, like a movie. In fact, if the screenplay has not been optioned, I think we should look into it. What a fascinating life!
It's unbelievable, isn't it? And you know, to imagine that he was only 19 years old when he was sent away, far away from his home, different country, working under atrocious circumstances, bombs falling all around him towards the end of the war. And you know what? I gave the book to my 18-year-old son. He's pretty much the age that this guy was when he was sent to Germany.
Oh,
and,
right.
Just to imagine what what it was like. And my son said as well, he finished the book in a couple of days, which for Gen Y is quite astounding. And he said it was fascinating. I couldn't, my heart was beating at times. I had to turn the pages to find out what happened next. Brad and Elisabeth done a great job. I mean, it's a true story, but it reads like a thriller, like a novel.
It's a fascinating read. And in fact, here's a look at the cover of the book so you know what you're looking for. Where can people find it again, Tom?
Anywhere you can buy books online, all the online bookstores, the ones that you prefer. But more importantly, you can find them at dutchthemedia.com, because Dutch the Media sells the book in Canada and the United States and across the world. Dutchthemedia.com, English language books.
This is a great opportunity for me to wedge in this little plug for Dutch the Media. It's also where you get Dutch the Magazine, De Krant, and tons and tons of Dutch-focused podcasts, books, publications, and much, much more. So I'll encourage you to go to dutchthemedia.com. Tom, thanks so much for today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
See you next time.
See ya.